Hey everyone and welcome. I was just making a few sounds with the new Korg Volca Modular. If you've watched some of my recent videos on the new Korg Volca, you're probably pretty familiar with what this particular device can do. And it's one example among many of using semi-modular synths to create Eurorack style synthesis setups. So this particular video actually though is not going to focus on the Korg Vocal Modular. This is the first in a series of videos called Going Modular, which focuses on my own approaches to getting started with the Eurorack modular system. So I will try to take you through some of the evolution of where I've been going with sound design and music composition, as well as where I have come from in terms of some of my previous experiences working with musical devices and so forth. So for me, getting into the world of modular synthesis really was an evolution coming out of some of my previous gear, and I'll feature some of that today to kind of describe where I've been going in terms of creating music. The current setup I have here is I have two tip-top audio cases with a bunch of modules in them, and then a tip-top audio happy endings kit, which has a smaller setup. And actually I created this out of some cheap wood, basically made my own case for it. And behind that you see my setup, my patch board for my DuPont module, which is the Folktech conduit and resist modules. And so this is one of some recent experiments I've been involved in, trying to use different approaches to patching sound to create musical compositions. In some future videos I'll get into some of the modules here, and I should say that this particular set of videos I'll be doing focuses on the entirety of the Eurorack modular journey. And I should say that there are so many great resources out there, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Muff Wiggler in terms of the mini posts and threads that get into issues relative to this world of synthesis. Of course, quite a bit can be done just looking at tutorials online, and you can learn a lot about modular synthesis from that world as well. And actually just went to grab my book. This is another example, I think, of how the world of modular is becoming more and more mainstream in the sense that people are getting into it. This is the new book, Patch and Tweak. I actually picked this up from Perfect Circuit. You can get it directly from the publisher. You can get it from a number of different music sources. It is chock full of information about the world of modular and Eurorack, and a lot of the modules in here I own. There are quite a few interviews related to creating music, creating modules, how people got into the world of modular synthesis, and really starting from the beginning to the end in terms of talking about even the format of modular, whether you're getting into the Buchla world or doing something more traditional here with the 3U system as it's called. So there's a lot of great information out there, and when I'm involved in anything, if I'm using a new module or if I'm shopping for a module, I often actually begin with the internet, and particularly YouTube. Like a lot of you, I go to YouTube not just for my own videos and my own content, but also to look for ideas for patching, look for ideas of approaches to sound design and so forth. Relative to the vocal modular, recently I've been just like checking out other people's approaches to patching as much as I can see it, because the DuPont cables are so small. I try to then replicate some of this, and this patch I was working on today was a modification of something I saw on YouTube. So I really do encourage you, to take advantage of YouTube, because there's just so much out there that's just amazing in terms of people giving their tutorials. You have, for example, Ben from DivKid, who will take you through individual modules, give you these up to 30-minute videos that shows you everything about using the module in musical and sonic senses. So I think it's kind of exciting to be able to go online and just get this immediate deluge, really, of information about Eurorack synthesis. And that's one exciting thing about being able to take advantage of some of the collaborations online. So in this particular series, I will try to cover everything. I've organized these videos thematically. For example, I'll have one video just focused on cables. I'll talk a little bit about types of cables, everything from the cable length to the barrel head, the width of it. Again, these are all mono 3.5-inch cables. A lot of times I find that and you probably find this as well, if you're trying to make patch points in your own environment, and really I think it is about ergonomics. It's about where modules are and how to access them. A lot of times, like if you're working with the Korg Volca, you notice like if I'm trying to do anything with the potentiometers, sometimes I'm getting stuck in between a cable, and so it's just you know, in some ways this replicates quite well the official world of Eurorack or Modular that you see here. In some cases, you might not have cables that are in the way. They're just serving a very functional purpose, and therefore you still have access ergonomically to what's going on in terms of your case, being able to adjust parameters, being able to patch new points, and so forth. If you watch someone like Colin Benders in one of his live events, he's often pulling cables from, I don't know if they're from the floor, somewhere below, and then patching in his massive setup and creating things on the fly. One of the cool things about doing modular is that every time it does seem very new and different. In fact, I've been trying to do this intro video now, I think 5 or 6 times, where I started with a patch, and I will jump to a patch in a second here. But then I thought it's not quite right and so forth. And in some ways, that's a good metaphor for this world, because you're doing something very organic, it's very expressive, it's really from the ground up. When I began with a patch in my setup, I basically unplug everything. And some people noted, I think it was Junkie XL, the great film composer, who has a massive Eurorack setup in addition to other instruments and VSTs and so forth. He was saying that he has about, I think, I was reading this in Patch and Tweak, 17 patch points in his system from the beginning that are just standard. And that might make sense. If you have a mixer bus or something like that, and you always are taking that out to your mixer, then maybe those are just automatically set up. Another example of that is very often I will have pressure points pre-patched with, say, 3 cables coming out of here, and I can then take those modulation sources and easily patch them. It's, of course, really up to you, but in the video on cables, I will get into all the dynamics of different types of cables, cable length, cables that allow you to do stackable situations where you can take an out, a CV, or an audio out and do that multiple times, if you will. You can do that twice. Or, of course, you can use a passive multiple module, I guess you can call it, if you will. These are pretty cheap, that allows you to take an audio or a CV signal and use that, in this case, 5 different times, basically, after you have your initial input in here. So in that video, I will get into all the dynamics of patch cables and everything else. I'll have a video as well talking about semi-modular gear and trying to integrate your Eurorack setup with non-Eurorack equipment. As an example, with the case of the Volca Modular, it's very easy to incorporate this immediately into your system. Basically, you have a CV in, and of course, as I said in some of my other videos, if you're using the CVN, be sure to use the DuPont cables that are outputs into one of the other blocks on your Volca Modular. But basically, I can take the CV input and I can modulate things here. I can also use the sync in and out to do some additional things that allow me to sync with my gates here, my triggers, this way to this way or this way to this way. So it's very easy actually to incorporate other gear in your modular setup. One thing I haven't done yet, but I could do with my Herman module, is connected to the computer. I'm specifically thinking about some upcoming revisions of some old tracks in Logic, and I thought I'll just take a USB out, run into Hermid into the clock input, and I could just turn that on so you see some lights here. And then based on that, I thought maybe I can do some recording where I will add some additional timbres or sonic approaches, if you will, to my computer tracks to give it a different pop or a different sound. I'll show you a patch in just a second that I think for me describes why Eurorack is so exciting in terms of what it sounds like and how that sound can evolve over time, and also the excitement as a composer, as someone who is creating something from the ground up. And that really is what I think is so exciting for many of us about the world of Eurorack and Modular, is it allows us to really do things from the beginning, and it seems very organic because one patch point is impacting another patch point. And often, particularly if you're splitting things, if you're talking about multiple ins and outs, then you start to think about like exponential forms of modulation or sound just because of how one thing impacts another. It's a very like viral system. There's nothing, I would say, very linear about Modular or Eurorack because of the way that it's approached in terms of sound design, modulation, and so forth. One thing I'll say initially is that if you're thinking about, and maybe I'll put up on the board here just some ideas, but I was thinking about this, like if you get started into Eurorack, and I should say that one option is to not take this route, and I'll show you some, I'll probably edit in this first video some of my previous gear, but in a future video I'll talk about semi-modular approaches. For example, I used to have a no-coast or an O-coast make noise. I also used to have a Kilpatrick Audio Phenol. And some of my old videos you can actually watch some experiments with that equipment. Very fun to work with, but at some point someone was telling me actually it was one of these first, I think my very first module I planned to buy. So for quite some time I was intrigued in using, and haven't used it in a while, I need to, the Coma Field Kit. And if you know about the Coma Field Kit, it's actually upside down here. It allows you to do quite a few things in terms of what's called electroacoustic music, particularly using piezo mics with homemade instruments. If you've seen some of my other videos, done quite a bit creating my own sonic devices, using some ideas online. This is actually a guitar box that I modified with some guitar strings and some other devices you can find online, some springs, some sandpaper, and this is actually an egg cutter of all things, and it has a very nice sonic quality to it. So this is an example of an electroacoustic device that I was inspired to create because of my introduction to the electroacoustic world of the Coma Field Kit. Based on the Coma Field Kit, actually someone on my YouTube channel said, hey, have you heard about a particular Bastel module? And it's this one here. It's the solenoid module, which I have hooked up here, and I've been planning to do something, a new composition using solenoids. And it is a very cool module that allows you to do some electroacoustic things, but in a way well beyond what you could do with the Field Kit. So my first bit of advice is to say that you can do a lot of the stuff I'm doing here using semi-modular gear. And I have to say, actually, the Korg Voca Modular, it really, for $199 US, it really is quite amazing, my personal opinion, in terms of what it can do. I actually think you could get this device, maybe 2 or 3 of them, and then you're starting to get up to $600. Maybe throw in one of the new Korg Voca drums, which I plan to purchase but don't have yet. It's coming out, I think, in mid-March of this year, 2019. And you could have a really amazing setup there, because the Voca drum, of course, has some experimentalism built into it with its 2 resonators, which I think could be quite intriguing. So I'm suggesting you could do stuff with a setup like this and not ever get into your Eurorack world. Likewise, you could do electric acoustic music using the Field Kit, also the newer Field Kit effects. But when I heard about this module, I thought this could take me in some new directions, because basically I can use here one solenoid and I can trigger it, but essentially what this allows me to do is to trigger things much more precisely, and I have 4 solenoids I can set up, so I can create my own percussion ensemble. So in a sense, my journey began with that module, as well as Mutable Instruments Clouds, which is so iconic. It's no longer produced, but you can get them relatively, I think, pretty cheap on reverb.com. You can also get the new versions of them, or the versions that are created by like other companies. They're actually a little smaller in terms of the size, HP. And so there's an option there certainly still to purchase this module, but for me, this had such a unique sound in terms of granular synthesis that I just found like I could only do in this particular module what I wanted to do, and I couldn't do it in other devices out there. It's very different, particularly once you start thinking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, either input or outputs in terms of patching, controllability, open firmware. So I have this currently running with the Parasite firmware, which is freely downloadable. And that's the other cool thing I should say about Eurorack initially, is that so many modules out there, my Muskrat, my Mofenzeet modules, I can plug in new chips. If I actually did purchase the chipset, I can change the sounds. The Disting MK4 Expert Sleepers is really amazing as a multifunctional module, and over time developers will give you new firmware, you download that firmware, and all of a sudden with the Expert Sleepers, I think it jumped by another 10 different functions. So in a sense, you're getting something that is always updatable because of firmware. Likewise, Plonk by IntelliGel, really nice percussion, acoustic modeling module. Recently, they added, same thing, new firmware, and so it now has saturation and bit crusher built in. It's one of the things I really like about this world of synthesis is that you feel like you're getting a lot of value for your money. I know a lot of people out there say that it's super expensive, which, you know, everything's expensive. If you love fly fishing, if you're a coin collector, if you like classic cars, if you like baseball cards, anything that has a hobby side of it, an enthusiast side of it, Star Trek is another example, people who collect things with Star Trek, then you could spend tens of thousands of dollars on any of those worlds, and we don't think of that. I think the problem is you look at a module online, if it's $300, $400, there's a new module out there. I saw a sampler module that's like pretty close to 900 bucks, and I thought that would be really amazing, but to try to justify or think about purchasing that price of one module for $900, it does seem a little steep. But if you think about what you get for that module in terms of functionality, in terms of the quality of the design, a lot of these modules are metal, very nice potentiometers, high level of production, nothing really seems cheap. And then also the fact that you can update firmware and add new functions or new chips shows you there's a versatility to this world. The other thing, of course, that's key with this is you can mix and match. And I should put up on a board here just a few ideas behind this. So one idea is that you could take a traditional synthesis approach. You could certainly stock up on, say, a mixer. You could have some VCOs. You could have some sound, some devices that are sound generating devices. You could throw in, you know, some effects or a wave folder. You would have a VCA or two. In my case, I have 8. I really got into the erogenous tones model of 8 things, and that's also replicated with the Hermid. And the assimilator, the Rossum module I was interested in, also has 8. So 8 actually seems to be kind of a good number, and you can start to pair things up rather logically than with your cables, as I'm doing here with all this HP that's taken up by erogenous tones, and they're really wonderful modules. So for me, this is almost like a envelope generator section, VCA section, and mixer. All these 3 modules here, along with Blip, which is a utility that plugs into the radar envelope generator, which is another thing I'll say is you often get additional modules that are not that expensive. In the case of the Folk Tech, the add-on resist was, I think, around 49 bucks, and used it's even cheaper, which adds more function to the conduit. That's kind of cool. So you can get a lot of Bastel modules that allow you to add additional functions to something, to a particular module, more patch points, more CV control, whatever. And so it really, I think, it behooves us in this community to say that there's a lot of discourse out there about the price and how expensive modular is, but I think we should throw out to the other side and say, this gear is so versatile and so amazing in terms of its potential to create sound, to modulate patch points on through your various modules, that we often forget about that. But so I guess I would say you could do like a basic setup initially, and you could just create a very small case, and Pico and 2HP allow you to create something quite powerful, I would say, using just a very few of these small modules that are between 2, 4, maybe 5 HP in terms of their width. Now, one thing that you might get into is that if you're using a lot of 2HP, and I really like them, if you put them close by, like up here, this is not a very good design, I would say, because what happens is as you start to patch, you run out of space, you start hitting up against cables, or you cannot control the potentiometers, the dials, the buttons, whatever, that in some cases you're pushing a button on one of these to change the sound of the reverb or whatever. So, they're great modules. They're also cheaper. You can definitely get in the under $100 range, particularly on reverb.com if you look for used modules. So it's not the case that every module out there is going to cost you $500, $600, $700. Some might, but again, you're getting what you pay for depending on your approach. So I think one way to go certainly is to create a basic setup initially. Another approach you could take in your rack would be to only do some of this electroacoustic stuff, as I mentioned. So I could get, and I have these, the 3 Bastel modules that do solenoids and DC and servo motors to do my electroacoustic stuff. And then I might also get, say, Mutable Instruments, the ears module, which allow me to do some similar things, and they're wonderful envelope followers, and just general gain control utility modules that if I have a really low signal, if I'm patching an audio signal, particularly I've noticed from the vocal modular, and I can't get that gain high enough, I can patch out of there into ears. I can tweak it as much as I want. I just take the simple out, and then I have my audio signal at a better level that's more usable. Likewise, I could also use that same signal as an envelope follower, trigger a gate signal somewhere in my modular setup. So the versatility, let's say, of any one module is really what, for me, makes this world worth the price that you have to pay sometimes. So you could do the electroacoustic approach and create a really small setup. I mean, just this bit of HP, I don't know how much that would be, I haven't measured it, is not a lot, and that itself gives you a lot of power in terms of creating electroacoustic sounds. Now, to do that, of course, I have to talk about what are some of my gate or clock sources, and then you get into, I think, another world where you could create a whole case or a system based on different approaches to gates and triggers. You could get a traditional sequencer module like the Hermit, which actually does quite a bit more than just sequencing. There's so much there to dig into in terms of the LFOs, in terms of ratcheting and arpeggiators and other effects that you can attach to the tracks and so forth. It also functions very well as a hub. MIDI in, MIDI out, USB host, USB device, and then of course CV in. And the cool thing about Eurorack is that anytime I have an in or an out, I can use that to my advantage. So what I have been doing lately actually is starting with the very basic Pico trigger, which I think is a great module. I actually bought a second one on Reverb, and I will use that as my main clock source, and then I'll slave all my other devices to that. So all I have to do is patch one of the outs to any number of, I just use A, and then I'm slaving that, so when I start my sequence off here, or whatever I'm doing, my modulation tracks, it's all slaved to that clock. And that's a really nice approach, and if I'm using these guys as well, one of the things I will do is take that clock out, I'll put a bunch of these on there, these shorter cables, and then I can start to use that as my source controlling my clock. Now again, there are cases where you might not care about having everything in time. You might want something more asynchronous if you're doing something very avant-garde or ambient. If you're doing ambient, particularly working with effects like clouds, in that particular case, you might actually want things not quite in sync, and there's an advantage to that. But I think deciding initially on how you plan to deal with your clock sources, what those might be, subdivisions, using divider modules, using logics. There's a whole slew of sections in Patch and Tweak on logic and clocks and so forth. And so quite a few options out there. And likewise, if you like nonlinear sequencing, you could get into getting a series of modules that allow you to do some things in some different ways in terms of your composition practices. And that's another side of this I want to suggest, is that the old days of like workstations where you turn the keyboard on and there was a sequencer and you recorded some parts, but everything was set up for you ahead of time. I think that world is really moving away more in favor of this world, which is more generative and organic, and I would say avant-garde depending on how you use it. So that's what's cool about using Eurorack modules, is you get to explore, you get to decide for yourself what you want to do, how you want to approach things. So I think, like a second thing or a second approach is just thinking about what are some of your clock, gate, sequencer sources as far as modules. How do you want to approach things there? Another side of this then, I think, gets into sound itself. And so what sort of modules do you want to get? Your VCOs, your sound generating devices. Recently, between IntelliGel, Plonk, and Mutable Plates, I found that those two sound sources are really amazing as synthesizer sound sources in terms of what you can do. And I'll show you in a second something I discovered, which I think will express for me why this particular world is so interesting. And actually, maybe I'll do an edit here, and let's jump to that sound experiment to give you a little bit of sound. Okay, so I wanted to just jump in and then show you this particular patch or approach, because for me, when I did this last night, I thought this really does describe to me, or will illustrate to you, why Eurorack is, I think, so powerful. So what I was doing, I started just with something very simple. I had a trigger. It's an example of Eurorack at its finest because it's already changed, but I had a basic just like 4-4 trigger coming out of the Pico trigger module going into the trigger input on Plonk. Okay, and you're hearing that now, and nothing necessarily spectacular about this, so I just have this set on a marimba patch, and what I wanted to do was to just create a new composition, and like I do a lot of times, I just start in one place. Nothing was pre-patched, and I thought I'll just start with a trigger and I'll begin sonically, and of course I can adjust the pitch. If I'm doing anything that requires a particular scale or tuning, then obviously I would think about this a little bit differently. In terms of pitch issues, I wasn't, and it was more by ear. I might also adjust the decay. And then I think what I was doing was I went in and actually might have had, let's see here, I think I had the plate setting. There's different objects and exciters that you can use, which is pretty cool about Plonk. It's a pretty amazing module, I have to say, one of the best ones I have. So nothing exciting about that, right? It's just very nondescript. So the first thing I did was I said I'm going to do a modulation source, and as I mentioned in this earlier video, I have, I think, here. This is a good example of Eurorack as it happens because sometimes I'm forgetting exactly what is controlling what. What I wanted to do was have, we'll just take a direct out for our clock. So I just thought I'll modulate using this particular track I had set up. So I thought, I would modulate a little bit by using a modifier here. I set it to the Morph 1 destination. It's a really cool approach is that sometimes you begin with one simple module, but you can do so much with that module by taking another input, using whatever trigger source you want to use. I could, for example, patch everything in, but I really love these passive multiples because you can just take one and go to many. So I can plug this into my divider module. And what I like about the divider is that you can create different rhythmic effects, and in a lot of cases, because you can control the actual the rate itself, it allows you a lot of power in terms of really dialing in a rhythm that could be your sort of rhythm of choice. So let's see what this does. So I have it just going in the Y mod input. And as you can hear there, it's creating like this distorted, almost like chorusy kind of sound because it's getting it to be such a high rate. In any case, starting with that, it's not particularly amazing or anything like that, but that was initial starting point. And then I happened to remember that I had my Disting MK4, and the firmware is 4 point something, I'm not entirely sure, but I had it dialed into M1, which I had to cheat and luck in my manual. And if you know the Disting, it's one of these modules that it's great, it has a lot in there, but I recommend one of these patch sheets. And again, someone, because they're generous, created this really nicely in an Illustrator or something like this, and has all these patches. What happens though is as the firmware gets updated, which is great, so expert sleepers, they're really on top of it, they create new firmware, and what happens is you start to then have to add new pages to this. I thought I would have one. So some of these change over time, and yeah, so there's a new audio playback mode and then an audio recorder, mono audio recorder. So I just added these in from the manual. So essentially we added new J's because it was before J1, 3, 4, 5. So it's a great module, but I find it to use it, I have to look at this all the time. I couldn't tell you the in from the out or what the function is. But I just had it dialed into this M1, which is delayed LFO. And I said, I'm going to just put this into the pitch input on Plonk. So you have kind of this first moment of discovery. And again, this is not anything complex. Anyone could do this at home, but it's just a matter of thinking about a type of sound or a timbre that I wanted in terms of a composition. So you go from the old, right? Kind of a just very generic marimba sound there rhythmically, and then I'm modifying the pitch input using this delayed LFO, and I can adjust the rate. And so that is its own becoming, that's one of the cool things about Eurorack. So before I did this, my clock, my tempo, if you will, was coming from my trigger module via this pretty simple pattern out here. And again, a mod track coming here, which I have synced to this clock using the ACV input. But my whole perception of this compositionally is that this is creating my tempo and my rhythm. The minute I plug in this new patch point, that changes. Not only does the pitch change, which you hear dramatically, but then the control of the tempo, because I'm modifying this input, is taken over here, right? And I can really slow that down and get to a point where I want to be. Maybe something like that. So that's pretty cool. And that is like definitely something that when I heard it, I thought, oh, that's going to be useful. That's definitely going to be something that I can use. I can further modify that. I can take an envelope from Radar. And actually, if I wanted to do this, I won't do it now, but a smart approach, and I have a multiple here. I'm using this audio source in a lot of different ways. I think I used 5 tracks of this audio, running it through wavefolding, running it through clouds, as I'll show you in a second, and then the pure source and so forth. But what I might do is take them out from Plonk, put it into my VCA, and say here, I could take channel 1. And then what I could do is run my Radar envelope generator CV controlling that VCA if I wanted to. And so that's definitely a possibility there. I can adjust things and create some absolutely different sounds, different perceptions of rhythm and so forth. I didn't do that, but that's what's really cool is sometimes I won't take a direct out from my sound source and into my mixer, and I'll say, let's run it through a VCA, let's modify that with an LFO or some source, or use the envelope generator, because almost immediately you create a sound that is much different than just the out from here. And even if it is just the out from here, depending on how many times I modulate it, like I'm doing with the slow LFO, all of a sudden I've taken a sound that was this and it's become something entirely different. So for me, that's what's really the number one, I would say, reason to get into Eurorack, is that the possibility for sound and modulation of sound and rhythm and CV sources seems rather limitless. It's only limited by patch points, your own creativity, and of course, how much you're willing to spend on your gear. So we have this sound, and actually right now with this sound, I could really envision this, taking this, and you know what I might do is I might take another splitter, multiple, and again take that sound, or take that source, take those modulation sources out of the multiple, and then I can run this into a second module, and then I can have sort of like a polyrhythm thing going. But for now, we have it in the pitch, and then this was the discovery. So I took the audio out into Clouds, which is a granular module, a granular synthesis module, if you will. And this is where I thought it really started to have this interesting, like, sonic quality to it. So let me turn on those 2 channels for you. And we'll turn down the original We'll just mute the original track. So just listen to that for a little bit. This is running Parasite 2.0 firmware. And all of a sudden, right, I've just transformed that sound even more. Now, just for fun, we could take our multiple. Let's run one back originally into the pitch of Planck, and then we'll run a second one into any number of the inputs on clouds, but maybe to get super dramatic, let's try volt per octave. So it changes it a little bit. And then maybe this is a point where I take my envelope and I might further alter what's happening on clouds. So what I'm just trying to emphasize in this example is that we're starting with one sound, this marimba sound here, that has a very recognizable or generic rhythmic quality to it, sonic quality. By adding this slow clocked LFO into the pitch input, I'm changing the pitch, I'm changing our perception of the rhythm, and then throwing that into clouds because of what it can do, and further altering it in terms of its inputs, I have something that's entirely different when we compare it to the original source. So those generations of sound and those generations of modulation that you might get when you start to patch things, I think is really what makes Eurorack an approach that you can't achieve in other approaches to sound or musical composition. So that, I think, is an example of just that discovery stage. I was just patching some things together, and I happened to take that output from the Disting Mark IV, put it into the pitch of the Planck, this running into my reverbs, and it just had a real feel to it. I was like, that sound is just really interesting and something that I was not necessarily looking for, but when I stumbled on it, I was like, that is really quite amazing. And I think for me is only possible in this particular sonic and modulation setup in terms of the world of Eurorack. So thinking about your sound approaches. Jumping back a little bit, I should have said as well, I haven't used it yet, but the Instruo Scion, which is very similar to the Data Garden MIDI Sprout, same idea, but it's a Eurorack module. This will allow me essentially to create sound using plant or biometric biofeedback data, basically. I could even use human skin and so forth. So that's another option in terms of creating indeterminacy. If you think of the traditions of avant-garde music with all the great composers, John Cage and others, indeterminacy was often a big part of what they were trying to do. And in those days, I remember this contraption, I think it was Stockhausen, set up with this fan and moving motor to create indeterminacy and different sound effects. You can do a lot of that now using Eurorack modules. And that's one cool thing about generative patches that change over time that don't seem to really have human agency or composer, sonic designer agency behind them. And I think that's quite amazing, like from that avant-garde perspective. So there's an option there to use that as another approach, similar to the discussion of electroacoustic approaches, that allows you to create indeterminacy or chance as part of your compositional processes. Maths, also jumps out here as a really great module that I think is quite important in terms of a modulation source, and I'm sure I'll feature that in a future video. The other thing I would say you could do with Eurorack is a lot of mixing and matching. When I first heard about Eurorack, I was very interested in Erica Synth's drone system, which all have these tube modules in them, and I just purchased a Fusion VCO, and it's one of these that when I first got it, I wasn't quite gelling with it. And recently I've been making some sounds and just it pops so dramatically in terms of the audio, using it as an audio in because of the tubes and the saturation and so forth. And so that's another side of this. You could certainly create a whole system based on one manufacturer's modules, whether it's Erica, whether it's Pico. You can purchase a fully fledged system from Perfect Circuit, Detroit Modular, Control Voltage in Portland, Noisebug in Pomona. Those are some of the places I think have a lot of good systems set up for you. And as a result of that, there's some consistency. Someone has thought very specifically about approaches to sound and modulation. Often it's the folks who make the module. So Erica's entire system, based on those two modules, will give you a really amazing, consistent sound. But you might be saying, I really want to customize. I don't need 2 VCOs, or I need 3 VCAs, and there's a lot of jokes about how many VCAs you need. Or I don't really like that particular clock source, so I want to use something else. And that's more the approach I've taken, is to say, can I customize my own system? And I would say is over time, you'll get a module, you'll use it, it may not gel with your system, and actually there's a space here. I had this wave folder, this was my wave folder section, and now it's open, and I purchased it on Reverb and I sold it back on Reverb. So there's almost like this, reminds me of a library a little bit, right? You check a book out, you read it, you turn it back in, someone else uses it. And Reverb is so competitive. I know I mentioned Reverb.com, but I've bought and sold so much on Reverb that I feel like they're really amazing just in terms of that service of offering people the opportunity to purchase a module. What I'll often do is I'll sell a module and then I'll use those Reverb bucks to buy a new one. And I think it's a cool thing. It does really almost feel like a library, a lending system where you're trying new things out. But there's certainly nothing wrong with that, right? You can sell a module, get a new one, and see if it fits your setup. For example, I purchased 3 of these Mofenzief muskrats because I really like the sonic approach, and I actually fitted them each with a different chip. But I've been thinking lately, like, does that justify the number of HP that these modules take up? And it's one of those things you think about in terms of ergonomics of your case. How big do you want your case to be? If you run out of room in one case, you get another case and then another case. And that part, I totally get where people get concerned, because it does seem like a recreational drug, right? Where you're like, oh no, I need another module to complete my system, and then you're talking about more money spent, more money spent. So I think that's a challenge. I mean, maybe you can for yourself decide, like for me, over time, this space is limited, so I wouldn't necessarily want to expand down here. I use this for my desktop stuff, for my video synth, for my reverbs and so forth. For other things like my sensors, which that's another approach. You can get sensors and use these in a Eurorack module to do some interesting things. So I can get a water sensor. Wouldn't recommend putting a cup of water right on your module, but you know, you could use different control systems. But what I'm saying with this is, you know, you probably have to set your own limits and decide how much do you want to spend, and then how big do you want your system to get. That itself will, I think, really determine initially what you're willing to do and the directions you're planning to take. But there's no harm and no shame in selling modules that are no longer working with your system. So I think another approach you could take then, you know, decide on your sound modules, decide which ones you want to use and how those are going to interact with the rest of your system. You could also certainly take a particular approach, say focusing on wave folding, a West Coast synthesis approach. And this little vocal modular, again, is very nice in terms of this block here that does your folding and the LPG and so forth on that side. But you could get a couple of wave folder modules as I have here, and then that will allow you to take sound and further modify it and mutate it and so forth. So there's an organic nature to things. I think if you're never just going to get one module and think of that module in and of itself. I might say, I like the Planck because it makes some really good sounds, but then what is the Planck going to interact with, as I expressed to you in this particular patch today? I think another approach you could take is you could think about using, like, probably a smaller system like this one as primarily an effects unit. So you could have a device like the Folktech conduit, which I have to say right now, I'm still, because of the complexity of this, and I've made it more complex creating my patch board here, and the fact that it has the resist module, which gives me these other like partials or overtones of sound, you know, it's really challenging to work with. And one of the things I will recommend is that you organize all your manuals. Not every manual, actually most modules don't come with manuals. So what I've done is I've often printed these out. This is for Qubit Audio Chance. And I sometimes forget, right? Like I forget, what does that particular input or output do if it's not marked? Or even if it is, I might want to know, well, what is the potential of using that? If you download alternative firmware like I did for Cloud's Parasite 2.0, I really need this to know what each of the modes are. And so that was pretty important when I downloaded that. I said, cool, someone online made a patch sheet for it. So that gives me all the information. So I think that's pretty important, is to have all your module information available. I don't personally like it as like PDFs. Some people like PDFs. For me, it's just too much to have to go through a screen, and I like to read it just in a binder. But that's the other side of this, is I think you want to know the potentials of what your modules can do. You will sometimes discover that they have features you didn't know of. Whenever I'm working with Plonk by IntelliGel, I find like there's a lot possible, but I have to really dial down in the menus. I was looking at one point for a technique that allows you to create these infinite sustains, and I was looking in the manual and I looked online, and it was really kind of a bit almost convoluted to find what I needed to find to make that happen. And that's one challenge of a more complex module that has a lot of menus and an OLED screen and a lot of nice features, is you have to certainly figure out how to use the modules. And even once you do that, using the modules musically or sonically in a way that you feel is appropriate, that obviously could take some time and learning and so forth. And so there's a real depth of knowledge, I think, that comes with Eurorack, because you have to think about how to use everything. A module for me like erogenous tone radar, someone just did a really great demo on YouTube that like a tutorial more or less. But I find this is a module where there's so many possibilities and switches that change the function of the envelopes from digital to audio and back, that I often forget what's happening on the module. And I think that's one challenge with some of the more complex modules versus a simple wave folder that maybe only has 3 switches or dials, and I know exactly what it's going to do because it's quite intuitive and obvious. But that's also the fun of Eurorack, is that there's a lot before you that allows you possibility to expand in the future, whether that means getting new modules or working with the modules you have, repurposing those, and possibly downloading new firmware that offers alternatives. So I was mentioning the effects approach. You could take, creating a case that, say, just had like a module like clouds and maybe a delay module. There's some very sophisticated, the IntelliGel Rainmaker delays, very amazing, very expensive, and takes up a lot of room in your case. But you could do that. You could also use smaller ones, Pico DSP, 2HP Verb. There are quite a few new distortion modules coming out that are interesting to me because I don't have distortion. So I think what might happen is you may not have a case just based on effects, but if you did, you could certainly have a pretty decent case. The bass player of the two-person band Paris Monster has a pretty small Eurorack case that he uses to really modify his basses he's playing, and I think it's a very cool approach that you could possibly think about. You don't need a huge case to necessarily create something interesting. So the effects potential would also be a possibility there. And I think overall, there are just what you might say are very, not generic approaches, but approaches that take into account all of these possibilities and try to create systems based on a number of different sonic or modulation approaches or ideas. And that's certainly something you can do. As I said, you can get rid of modules, you can get new modules, and really think of this as something that evolves over time, kind of like a patch itself, as I demonstrated in that patch earlier. So I think what I'll do in the future then is, when I make these videos, I'll try to focus on a particular theme, a particular approach, and maybe I'll put up now some of the videos I've actually finished. And I've done 3 of these already, and that's why I said I really need to do this introduction, because I keep thinking I'm going to do it, but then I put it off because I'm creating a patch, a composition, and then I think I'm going to record something, and I do record it, but then I disassemble everything and start from scratch. And I think that's a metaphor, as I said earlier, for me about what this world of Eurorack and modular really means. It's something that is organic, it's something that grows with you, there's possibility, it offers expression, I think, in terms of what you're trying to do. And I think in terms of genres, it's one of the approaches out there in terms of gear that isn't limited, say, to the type of genre that you're doing. I sometimes feel like Ableton, for example, and I'm not saying you couldn't do other genres, but Ableton is really focused on a lot of like EDM or dubstep or electronic music, DJ type setups, and it's not necessarily like a lot of people are maybe using, say, Ableton for experimental electronic avant-garde music. Now you could get into Ableton and actually do a lot of the stuff you could do here. It's just a different approach. And I think that's the other thing to say is you can do some of this stuff electronically on your computer. You can download the free VSTs that allow you to replicate the world of modular. For me, though, there's something physical. Every time I'm patching a patch point, there's something just really satisfying and tactile and definitive about creating that patch point. I would almost say it's a little existential just in terms of the approach to sound. So for me, doing it on a computer, in fact, I have a keyboard, it's off screen, it's actually up on a wall there on a shelf because I find I don't use it very much. Now, if I'm doing stuff for like more musical film type stuff, like a soundtrack thing, then I may not use this. I might use my VSTs, and I have a pretty extensive VST library in Contact on my computer. But for me, that's a different world. Now, I mentioned earlier, I might want to try to combine these two worlds and see how they could speak to one another using my VST compositions, linking it to here using Hermid, and seeing what the possibilities are there. So I think that could be kind of exciting to think about the potentials for creating some new sounds and so forth. But I think, you know, what's cool about Modular and Eurorack is that you can really approach it from any number of genres. You could do electronic, you could do dubstep, you could do techno music, you could do experimental avant-garde. A lot of the stuff out there, which I personally really enjoy, has that experimental avant-garde ambient approach. So really, it is the sky's the limit when you think about the possibilities of Eurorack and Modular. So I'll continue to do these videos. Just look out for them. I will intersperse them with other experiments on the Korg Volca or other gear and just general musical compositions. And by all means, as many of you do, just give me comments and feedback. Show me your own experiments that you're working with in terms of modular or semi-modular, whatever you're doing. And for me, one of the most exciting things about it is the fact that there is a community out there willing to help and willing to assist others in terms of talking about some of the challenges and problems that you might encounter as you're moving into this world of going modular. So please come back for additional videos in this series, and as always, thanks for watching and thanks for commenting here on YouTube.